Comics?
Comics.
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 Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast. Comics?
Warp 1, engage!
Star Trek Generations.
Transport complete. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White.
And you have just been beamed into another episode of We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones.
And while you're beaming on the other side of this broadcast, you may as well check us out on social media at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
And in addition to social media, you should also check out our website at bonelesscomicspodcast.wordpress.com and our YouTube channel, tinyurl.com/bonelesscomicspodcast. Wherever you find us on the web, give us a like, subscribe to us, and send us comments with your thoughts on our podcast.
Yeah, definitely everybody subscribe if you have the opportunity on Spotify or Apple or YouTube. I think YouTube is turning into very quickly a place where we've thrown a lot of really interesting supplemental stuff that people can enjoy. So if you enjoy the episodes, definitely check us out there. And Joe has put up his one-shot series, and there are also video versions of our podcast that may have a little bit more visually going on that will kind of show you some of what we're talking about. So I think that's a really good place to go if you're wanting a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, we enjoy making content, and sometimes it's not always easy to get together and record a full episode, so we're trying to put together like little bits of promo stuff and, you know, just things to kind of keep interest going until the next episode comes out. So here we are.
Yeah, for sure. And so speaking of the next episode, we are going to be covering Star Trek Generations, which is adapted by Michael Jan Friedman and penciled by Gordon Purcell after a script by Brandon Braga, Ronald D. Moore, and Rick Berman, who are all, if not Star Trek writers, creative people involved in the Star Trek franchise and in this movie in a producer capacity. This is going to be a little bit different than a normal episode because we are actually reviewing a direct adaptation of a film. And for that reason, we're probably going to be going a little bit longer because there's a lot of information for us to get through. So we're going to be splitting it up into 2 episodes in order to accomplish that for you guys and really do it justice.
Yeah, and we like talking about Star Trek, and we could probably do it all day. So we want to make sure we have enough time to do that as well.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if you guys are down for all day, but we could definitely do it. So
yeah. So as Mike mentioned, this is a comic book adaptation of a movie. It was actually written and published in April 1994, which was 7 months prior to the release of the film to theaters on November 18th, 1994. Hollywood back then didn't start to capture films digitally until 2000s. So Michael Friedman had the impossible task of condensing a 2-hour movie script into 58 tiny comic book pages. He relied on art descriptions in the script, concept sketches for the movie, and very tiny proofs of black and white still photos he was able to acquire from the New York Publicity Department of Paramount Pictures. But he and Gordon Purcell had no idea how the directors or actors would actually portray what was in the script, nor what the final edit would look like. So he says in a few behind the scenes pages at the end of the book, "If you found something that is off, or if you find the little continuity piece I added, please be kind. I may know a lot about the movie, but I'm going to be like the rest of you. I'll be standing in line waiting to see Star Trek Generations."
Yeah, so this is a movie that particularly for me holds a very special place in my heart because this is the first one that I saw in theaters. So back in 1994, when it released, I would have still been living in Macomb, Illinois. And there was a theater across from our Neiman's grocery store, which I don't even know if that chain is still around. But yeah, there was a theater across the street from it. And I had been a Star Trek fan for probably just a couple of years at this point. So I was familiar with The Next Generation. I had seen the original series movies on VHS. And Deep Space Nine was also ongoing. That was actually my first Trek, oddly enough. So this is really what I would describe as peak Star Trek. This is kind of the point where it was reaching its most popular point, So I would argue that maybe First Contact in 96 was probably there was the most Star Trek going on at one time whenever that movie came out. But this was right before that period. So TNG had just ended. Deep Space Nine, I believe, was in its second season. And it was very popular. It was very much in the public consciousness. And honestly, my strongest memory of seeing this movie in theaters is just that there was so much audience participation. I was there. I was probably one of the youngest people in the theater because I would have been about 12 years old. There were mostly college age people and then, some older people there as well, like couples and stuff that had gone. But my parents just dropped me off. And they were like, we're not going to watch that, nerd thing with you. You can enjoy that. Yeah, but I just remember it's one of my first memories of being part of a theater audience as well, where everybody was kind of reacting to the jokes out loud, and it really, you just kind of got that communal feeling of everybody being engaged with what was going on. So I know this movie very well. I've seen it probably upwards of 20 times, and so I am really excited to sort of revisit that time in my childhood, but also read the comic book adaptation and talk about that today. So
yeah, unfortunately, I missed the theater experience of seeing this for the first time. Mine actually was First Contact, and I had the same sort of theater experience and seeing cameos and things, and the audience just going nuts. And I was able to appreciate it at that time, which was really good. Generations, I don't remember the first time that I actually saw it, but I do remember seeing it multiple times, and one of them was actually at a Star Trek convention. They had a showing. So I stayed late to watch the movie again at that point, but I had seen it before then. So I think I was just accelerating my interest into Star Trek around that time, and I had just missed the premiere of Generations in the theater. So,
well, I mean, if you had to answer the question of like, when is the first time you saw Wrath of Khan, or when is the first time you saw like any of the original series movies.
Oh, geez.
That's kind of my experience. That's like that, like for you with Generations, where I'm just like, I have no idea when the first time is that I saw those movies. Like as long as I can remember, I've known about them, I've seen them. And so Generations may be that way for you, where it's just like you can't remember a time before you saw it.
Yeah. So this is definitely something that's very close to both of our hearts. And, it's been so long since we first saw these movies, and we've seen them so many times since then that I think we can practically recite most of them from memory, if not, key scenes, and also the musical score that goes along with them, because we're not just into the movies, but we've listened to the musical scores to really all of these movies multiple times. So we're very familiar with them.
Yeah, speaking of Dennis McCarthy as the choice for this movie, this is really one of the only instances of them having a series composer come over and actually score one of the films, because they would typically, shell out for somebody a little more expensive, like Goldsmith moving forward. But it at least for this particular movie, I think it fit really well. And in a lot of ways, this feels like the real finale to Star Trek: The Next Generation, the series, even more so than the last episode does to me.
Yeah.
Because this really puts a pin on the Enterprise D era. So, yeah.
Well, and we blow up the ship. Spoiler.
Yeah.
It really puts a pin in it by destroying the ship and saying, well, we're pretty well done because the ship's blown up and people are probably going to get reassigned, so it's all over, which it isn't, because they come back for 3 more movies and so on and so forth, and the Picard show, so we know that it's not the last that we'll hear of them, but it definitely was the last of the Enterprise D.
Somehow I doubt that this will be the last ship to carry the name Enterprise.
Well, and the last time you're seeing the TNG uniforms and just those sets and that sort of classic design that was used on the show. So
yeah, that was another cool thing that I like, how they mixed in the TNG outfits or uniforms and the sort of DS9, I guess you'd call them uniforms, because that's where they first premiered. It was really nice to see that sort of transition from one uniform to the next, because it seems like every time we've had a uniform change, it's because there's a new season or a new show or a new movie. But this, I think, is the only one where we actually have some crossover of the uniforms to really see that Starfleet is, in transition of this uniform style.
Yeah, that's
was
that's
neat.
a really neat, like, understated. I don't even know if it's a story point, but it's just a really cool detail that they added where you are kind of seeing them like slowly throughout the movie changing from the TNG uniforms to the Deep Space Nine style uniforms. Where I know Picard doesn't have the DS9 uniform at the beginning of the movie, but by the end he's wearing it when he's down on the planet. So
Yeah, that was just a nice transition, I think, for the fans to be like, okay,
Mhm.
we're taking these characters from this show and we're sort of furthering them along and getting you used to the change instead of everybody just shows up in the new uniform right away and you're just like, okay, these are the characters I remember, but what are they wearing?
it's funny because it really does just remind me of how interconnected everything felt during this time. Deep Space Nine and Next Generation and Voyager really felt like they were taking place in the same universe. It was the same production team. There was kind of the same level of care being put into all of those things. And so this movie fits right into that pocket where it almost has the feel of an episode of Next Generation that has a way, way bigger budget, as opposed to the next three movies, which very much feel like, this is a capital M movie. We've changed all the sets. We've changed all the uniforms. Everything is sort of elevated to that film level.
Yeah, just sort of like an episode plus or like
Mhm.
a two-parter episode, but as a TV movie, but then even a step further than that as like you said, a higher budget movie.
Yeah.
So when the movie opened, it was actually at the top of the United States box office its first week of release, and it did gross a total of $118 million worldwide. Again, this is in 1994. Critical
Mhm.
reception was mixed, with critics divided on the film's characters and comprehensibility to a casual viewer. And I think a lot of that is, there wasn't a lot of serialization on TV like you see now, where, streaming services, you sort of expect to, if you're going to watch 10 episodes, that the story arc is going to be over those 10 episodes. Whereas, back then, TV, if you did something serialized, you would lose certain audiences because they weren't able to keep up with the story and what was going on. And this is definitely one where if you don't know who Kirk is, you haven't watched the original series, or you've watched the original series, but you haven't watched any The Next Generation, you don't know who Picard is, or some of the characters in between, some of this could be lost on you. So I can understand that being like a mixed critical reception, because basically either people familiar with the film are going to be like, hey, that was great, and people not familiar with the characters or some of the series are going to say, well, I didn't get it. So
Right.
it is one you do need some information on other things to see.
I would agree with that, except that I think that Kirk and Picard, specifically those two characters, have entered into the cultural zeitgeist enough that I think even people that don't know Star Trek would know who those characters are.
That would be a
So
good question for social media.
yeah, I think so. But I especially and I think Spock maybe even more so than Kirk
Yeah.
is like sort of a recognizable, when people think of Star Trek, that might be one of the first things they think of. But I think moving forward, you can't really expect that with Deep Space Nine and Voyager. But I think definitely for the original series and Next Generation, they were popular enough that I don't think it's too big of an ask to have an audience come into this and have some knowledge of, what's going on. So,
Right. Well, especially today with Star Trek actually gaining more popularity again,
right.
and being out there, to stream, easy access for that. I think watching it now it's a lot more attainable to see than it was in the 90s.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, for one, you don't need nearly as many VHS tapes.
That was a lot of VHS tapes.
It was a lot of VHS tapes.
I had a whole cabinet full of VHS tapes that were just The Next Generation.
Yeah, hit pause to edit out the commercials and all that. So,
yeah.
But we are here to talk about the comic book adaptation.
Yes.
Of Star Trek Generations.
So this was adapted to comic book form by Michael Jan Friedman, who was a prolific novelist for over 30 of Pocketbook's line of Star Trek novels, and co-wrote the TV episode Resistance from season 2 of Star Trek Voyager. He's also written novelizations of Fantastic Four, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, Predator, and X-Men. As a comic book writer, he's written the story for a few single issues here and there of things like Batman, Flash, Green Lantern Corps, Justice League, New Titans, and Superman. He's actually currently working on a Kickstarter campaign to fund a volume of short fiction called Headless and Other Improbable Excitations of the Muse, which he admits is too long of a title. He, he really likes the work he's doing and is super proud of it, so that's good. I mean, I hope I'm still producing something I'm proud of when I'm 66. Heck, if the podcast continues, we'll be well into like season 27 in the year 2048. Talk about the future.
Well, we might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit there, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
Still, though, it's good that he's still active and doing something that he's proud of, you know, from then till now. It's just really nice to see that he didn't just do this adaptation and then, you know, drop off the face of the earth.
I mean, Michael J. Friedman is somebody that if you were reading Star Trek novels at all in the 80s or 90s, you were going to see his name pop up multiple times.
Yeah.
The word prolific was definitely the right word for you to use, because my memory is that there's like dozens of novels out there by him. So, and again, it's just, that was the time. I mean, Star Trek was really at, you know, almost the fever pitch of its popularity during this era.
Yeah. Good time to put forth a comic book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a few notes on Gordon Purcell, the penciler here. I did want to mention really interesting tidbit here that I recently realized. I was sold an issue of the Star Trek The Next Generation comic from the early 90s that was penciled by Purcell that I didn't notice until I was reviewing my collection just a few weeks ago, that it is actually signed in gold Sharpie by him on the cover.
Wow.
So yeah, it's an issue that has Gowron and Picard kind of facing each other, and then there's like a Tholian in the middle. It's a really cool cover, but yeah, until I was using the Legion of Comic Geeks app and sort of going through my collection, and you know, I don't know why like the OCD thing of organizing and having that all digitally in my phone is satisfying, but that's what I was doing. But I happened to notice it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even notice that I didn't even know that I had this signed by him. So
that's awesome.
That was a really cool Easter egg to find. But he is about the same age as Michael J. Friedman. So he says that he learned to love drawing by watching cartoons of Batman and Spider-Man as a child. And he's 63 years old, and he graduated from the University of Minnesota with a bachelor's degree in studio arts and theater arts. So what's interesting about that is that he didn't specifically go to school for the sort of comic strip or comic book type art. He was very much more in the film, you know, school of arts. So it's interesting then that he didn't become like a storyboard artist or something like that, because I think that's actually what his training is. But instead, he began his career in comics at DC Comics in 1988 on a Dr. Light backup story. This is not the Mega Man Dr. Light. It's the DC Comics villain, I believe. So just for anybody that's confused, that's not the same guy. But that was a backup story in The Flash number 12. And while he has done quite a bit of work on mainstream superhero comics like Moon Knight, Fantastic Four, What If, Superman, Justice League Unlimited, and the Batman Chronicles, he is really mainly known for Star Trek. So we're really talking about Purcell's bread and butter today. He's, again, prolific. There's that word again. One of the most prolific pencilers of Star Trek comic books. He did 2 movie adaptation comics, the other one besides this one being Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And he has penciled runs on all 4 of the original Star Trek franchises. So the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. His work on Star Trek comics has taken him from DC to Malibu and finally ending at IDW Comics, and they're the current holder of the Star Trek rights. So he's basically just followed wherever the licensing agreement for that property was around from company to company, which is really interesting. I mean, he must really be passionate about Trek, honestly. In addition to being famous for his realistic renditions of Star Trek actors, He's been called on to do other media adaptation comics based on the X-Files, Xena Warrior Princess, Lost in Space, Godzilla, The Terminator, and Barbed Wire. And he's famous for being able to capture the warmth and emotion of actors' likenesses in still images. And that is very much something that I noticed when I was reading this story. In fact, I don't know really how to describe his style, except that it's really a photorealistic reproduction of the actors. The difference between the other comic we reviewed is that I'm not seeing specific like photographs of an actor that look like they've been copied or traced over. You know, he does some of his own posing, and very interestingly, some of his posing and some of his shots that he composes for the book are really similar to what ended up in the final print of the film. And I'm not sure how intentional that is. I don't know if they had access to storyboard information or what, but I was actually really blown away by how many times I would be looking at a panel going, yeah, that's pretty much the scene. And they did this 7 months before the movie came out. So that really kind of blew me away. I really can't say enough good things about the art. The only negative I would say is that we are right on that line before computer coloring came in. So we're really just looking at flat colors on everything. And also everything is fully lit, which makes it look very, very different from the movie. Everything is kind of bright and easy to see. This movie was given a very dark lighting scheme, which doesn't make a lot of sense because it's not consistent with the way the Enterprise looked on the show. However, what they were doing in the comic book was more consistent with the show than what they did in the movie, oddly enough. So that's kind of, I don't know, just a little interesting thing I noted about the art in this.
Yeah, that was something that really got me after rewatching the movie too, is how dark it was. Like all the lights burned out at the same time or something. And
yeah,
I don't know if that was like to set the mood or something, but they had 7 years of TV show to put these characters together. So I don't know why they would feel like it would be more dramatic to have all the lights out, especially because it's just kind of strange. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed the brightness of the comic and how everything was well lit. And even though like, it doesn't have like computer coloring and all that stuff, I think every uniform drawing of every person has like all these ruffles in it of where the uniforms bend and everything. So there's still a lot of shading and a lot of good color to it that I really enjoyed. The only thing that I would say I didn't like was the way that he drew Counselor Troy. Just something about her, just I don't know, just that one rendering, just I was like, oh, that's Troy. That looks weird. But
I want to bring up something about Counselor Troy, but we can wait until we get to that point in the story. But I have more of a writing concern with what happened with her in the comic book versus the movie. So yeah, that'll be something we can get into later.
Yeah, we'll get into that stuff. I just wanted to comment on like the art style as far as that. I feel like I have more to say about this one than I usually do, and I don't know if it's just seeing a movie version of it helped, but I'm glad that they used a penciler. Well, and he's famous, well, prolific for penciling for Star Trek, but it's really nice that they used the tiny proofs to sort of mimic what the movie was doing, but he still drew it himself. Like he didn't trace over anything. He didn't like copy it exactly. More of he copied it in his style. And I think that's really what you want from something that's adapting media is if you're going to use those poses, you're going to use the characters, draw them in your style. Like don't trace it. Don't use pornography stills like some of the other artists have done. Like just do your own thing. And it was really neat to see this, I think. Yeah,
sorry,
exactly. So that's I just wanted to throw that out there for the art as well.
Yeah.
So I guess we can get into the story a little bit. I think we're going to try to condense a story synopsis in here because, again, it's a 2-hour movie that was condensed into a 58-page comic book, which we're going to condense into this podcast episode or these...
like 3 paragraphs.
Yeah. So 3 paragraphs was about the smallest I could get this. So please just bear with me. This is for anybody who hasn't seen the movie or just needs a refresher because you haven't seen it in a while. But basically the plot of the comic is the same as the movie. There's just some, I wouldn't call them changes because they didn't know that they were necessarily changing anything because they
Right.
used the original script. So really, the comic book is probably more true to what the original story was, and the movie is sort of the edited or cut version that you get to see. And we'll get into some of those differences here later. But for the story itself, you should definitely see this movie if you haven't. But essentially, what happens is there's a space time anomaly called the Nexus, and inside of it, time has no meaning. So, around 200 people from a race called the Elorians, which Guinan is from, they were caught and entered the Nexus after the time of Captain Kirk on the Enterprise B, which was the third starship to bear that name. So, we hadn't seen the TV show Star Trek Enterprise yet, so this was the third ship.
Right.
Kirk is present on that ship. He's lost to the Nexus while helping to free as many Elorians as they can, which included Guinan, who was seen on The Next Generation, and then also a new character named Dr. Tolian Soren. So essentially, Soren, he feels cheated. He wants to go back to the Nexus. He's willing to do whatever it takes and hurt anyone it takes to get back there. But it takes him 78 years to start putting his plan into motion, which brings us into the time period of the Next Generation crew of the Enterprise D under Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Soren uses a substance called trilithium, which we'll get into later, to create a weapon that can destabilize a sun, which alters the gravity in a solar system and can redirect the path of the Nexus to a planet where he can once again experience a world free from time and death. So Captain Picard tries to stop him, but gets pulled into the Nexus as well, where he meets up with Captain Kirk, and the two captains leave the Nexus to enter a point in time right before the weapon is fired and stop Soren from destroying a heavily populated solar system. Unfortunately, in the course of the final battle, Captain Kirk is killed, but he does make a difference and saves the galaxy for what would be his last adventure. So that, in a nutshell, is Star Trek Generations.
One other detail that I wanted to throw in about Dr. Soren and the El-Orians specifically is that they are incredibly long-lived, and that is they basically look like humans, but they live for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that had been established already in The Next Generation, but we did not know the name of Guinan's race until this movie, and I don't think had seen anyone else of her race either until this movie. So this was really kind of a big deal for her character and fleshing out a little bit more of that backstory. But if you listen to Joe read that saying 78 years and you were like, whoa, he must have been ancient by then. No, because he's an El-Orian. I don't know what he was doing for that 78 years, if he was just letting his hate fester or like what, like just sitting in a closet being angry until he came up with this horrific plan. But yeah, that's Dr. Soren. So really heading into Star Trek Generations, the movie opens with the christening of the USS Enterprise B, which again is going to be the first Enterprise that has not had Captain Kirk as the captain of it. So this is a very well, I realize that, but at this point in continuity, that was accurate.
Well, because I mean, you had
although I guess we had Pike, we had Captain Pike before him.
Well, Pike was before him, but after him, we had Commander Decker, who was in charge of the Enterprise. We also had Spock, who technically captained the Enterprise for a time without Kirk. So
yeah, during Wrath of Khan, that's true.
Yeah.
At the beginning. Wow, that's a continuity issue with the dialogue in the beginning of the movie.
It is, but at the same time, like in both of those movies where we have somebody else captaining the Enterprise, Kirk shows up and he takes over. So from a story point of view, it's not really that big of a deal, but it's one of those little nitpicks like, well, technically that's not correct.
So technically.
Yeah. Exactly.
And this was before we knew about Jonathan Archer as well. So one of the biggest differences, honestly, in this comic book is that we are going to have several deleted scenes, many of which were actually filmed, by the way, that show up in the comic book that are excised from the movie itself. And so the first one is the orbital skydiving scene, which what this honestly does is it kind of continues a trend or a character trait that they showed for James Kirk in Star Trek V, where he's kind of doing these dangerous stunts on his shore leave or his time off. And so you kind of get the impression that he's not really able to relax or enjoy downtime without sort of mimicking the danger of his day job. I mean, so, but honestly, what struck me the most about this scene is thematically, I don't think it fits quite as well as seeing the christening of the Enterprise B, with and sort of following the champagne bottle through space like we do in the movie, because this does kind of feel like a story beat that we had already done in Star Trek V, and it is also oddly what struck me about it, because it is so similar to the opening of Star Trek V, is that it's really honestly kind of indescribably sad that DeForest Kelley and Leonard Nimoy didn't want to come back. And so we have Scotty and Chekhov with William Shatner instead. It just, their dialogue is fine in the comic book and all of that, and it works just fine. But to me, it was more noticeable that they weren't there in that scene in the comic because it was so similar to what we'd seen in a previous movie. So I don't know, Joe, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, it sucks not to have, the whole gang together, but at the same time,
Right.
like, this is more of a promotional event because we have the media present, and they want to
Yeah.
really christen this new Enterprise that doesn't have Kirk or any of the original crew assigned to it. So I think having like a smaller panel works, but yeah, there's definitely, especially in the movie, like there's this like permeating feeling of like sadness, and they're old and nobody needs them anymore, and what's the point? And this feeds into when we see Kirk later in the story as well, where he's kind of just like, well, I think the galaxy owes me one, and it's not like anybody out there needs me anymore, so what do I do with myself? And this whole conversation then, which is very short, but Kirk and Picard have about like duty and doing what's right, and that sort of thing, and that actually continues. It's really nice. Spoilers for the new Picard show, but that sort of theme sort of ties into this first episode that has just recently aired as of this podcast episode.
Oh,
where
wow.
you get that feeling of they've spent their whole lives obligated to their uniforms, and now that that's kind of that part of their life is over, what's next? Like, what do you do with yourself? And you feel like you're not as needed as much. So there's this huge theme there that I think the comic book unfortunately just doesn't get into, because they're trying to get through all the story, and it's really just panel after panel of dialogue running through it, and they don't really give it time to breathe. But I think you get that emotion watching the movie, just kind of seeing the looks on their faces, just being,
Yeah.
feeling a little bit sad, and seeing Demora Sulu, like, well, Sulu had a family and a child, and now she's in Starfleet and all this stuff. And what have you been doing with yourself, Kirk? You've been orbital skydiving? Yippee. He kind of takes that to heart, and you can see it in the actor's face. William Shatner does a phenomenal job.
They honestly, yeah, it really struck me this time, because I did rewatch the movie again. I think you did too, but it really struck me this time how much the original series actors have settled into their characters at this point, and how good they are at just falling right into that comfortable place and portraying that character. Both Chekhov and Scotty and Kirk, all just, you can tell that the actor is just, it's just as natural as breathing or playing these characters at this point.
Mhm.
And it's for those three, this is the 7th movie that they've done, and then they did like 79 episodes of the original series together as well. So yeah, they've been playing these characters for 30 plus years at this point, so it makes sense. But it also really came across to me, and this is something that I noticed in the comic book as well as the movie, that these characters really have, in a way, more personality and more charm than the Next Generation cast. And I don't mean that necessarily as a slam against the Next Generation. What I'm saying by that is most of the Next Generation characters are really more defined by just what their job is. And there's not really a whole lot to them outside of that. And the writers did a very good job of taking those characters and being able to pull things out of them. But really, besides Picard and Data, I don't think there's anybody else. Riker might be probably a third, after them. I don't think there's anybody else on that cast that feels as developed and fully fleshed out, or really that has the charm of these original series guys. So it was really a special moment kind of seeing them together again, even though it wasn't the classic trio of Spock, Kirk, and McCoy. I don't know, Joe, did you feel like the orbital skydiving scene needed to be there, or did you feel like that one was, I mean, did you feel like it was additive to the story?
I think knowing what I know, it wasn't necessarily useful, but it still would have been nice maybe to have one additional very short scene of just maybe to really hit you over the head with, Kirk he's retired and
Right.
he's sort of just coming back as a celebrity more than a captain.
Right.
And just getting a little bit more of that. I think maybe would have been good, but yeah, I think in general, seeing him do all these stunts or that sort of thing, or do the Oliver Queen where he's like, at the beginning he's just like doing stuff just to feel alive and whatever. Like you said,
Right.
we got that in Star Trek 5, and I think it was really well done there, and I think it would have taken away from this movie to have more of that in it.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I'm I'm honestly, I don't think that scene needs to be in the movie, but it is one of those kind of nagging little pieces of information that we knew about it at the time the movie came out, and we didn't see the deleted scene released until like these were on DVD, like 10 15 years later, because and the reason we knew about it was because they made action figures that were based on scenes of the movie that ended up getting cut. So we had these action figures at home that we're kids, we're playing with them, and then you go to the theater and you're like, well, where was the part where Kirk wore that like shiny silver outfit and stuff? So it is really neat, just as a bit of trivia, to see it back in place in the narrative of the comic, I think. But yeah, I think I'm going to agree that I don't think it feels like it's completely necessary.
Yeah, that's something that's always perplexed me about action figures and toys and stuff, and I get that the way the timing works out, that they have to have these things ready ahead of time to coincide with the release of a movie, but it seems like you get so many things like this where you have an action figure that's from a deleted scene, and so it just makes no sense.
Right.
Or you get an action figure that's a major spoiler for something that happens in the movie, like a character or a set, or like Legos have done this.
Yeah,
before.
I was going to say Lego is like the number one spoiler of movies right now.
So it's funny to see how many toys there are out there that are either from deleted scenes or from major spoilers.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the original series crew, but there's also a new crew here that are taking on the command of the Enterprise B. And I specifically want to talk about John Harriman, because he seems like he's never been in command before. Like, if he's the captain, he presumably was a commander before, and he's presumably taken the captain's test and all the stuff that we've seen in episodes. So why does he seem like he's completely new and green? And would you really trust the flagship of the Federation to this guy who seems completely inept? And I want to provide a quote here from Phil Farrand, who's the legendary nitpicker for the original series and the Next Generation episodes and movies. He says, "Where did Starfleet drudge up this Harriman guy? Is Harriman's ability to command getting delivered on Tuesday as well?" So that's a running gag in this, and that everything that the Enterprise B seems to need to fight off this crisis that they find themselves in is not installed yet and will be delivered on Tuesday.
Tractor beam, photon torpedoes,
Medical
the
crew.
half the medical staff. Yeah, he's the guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off that has like an abusive father and pushes his car off the ledge at the end of the movie. And I think he was much better cast for that role than he was for John Harriman, the captain of the Enterprise B in this movie. I don't actually know that the performance of the actor is bad, but the writing around him is definitely not good. It makes they needed a reason for Kirk to step up and take command during this crisis situation, but I think that the writing team, and I'm not going to blame Michael Jan Friedman for this because it's in the movie.
Right.
I think the writing team of Moore, Berman, and Braga just overcompensated a little bit, and they made it look like John Harriman should not be in command of a starship ever. I mean, they'll hear a distress call and he just kind of pauses like he doesn't know what to do and looks around, and then he's like, well, signal the nearest starship. We don't. And then he's kind of like making excuses like, well, we don't have a full crew aboard, so we can't handle it.
Yeah. Like I would totally understand if he was some kind of, I don't know, retired admiral or some sort of like public figure, like a PR guy who's taking the ship around just to kind of show it off. But, at the same time, like you'd still have some kind of command staff aboard. But
right.
It's funny that you mentioned the distress signal because they leave Earth space dock and they say, well, the Enterprise is just taking a trip around the block as a PR stunt, but they're the closest ship to respond to this distress call. Did they leave Earth defenseless? Like, where is everybody?
That's such a problem with the story that they say that the Enterprise B is the only ship in the quadrant when they're at Earth. Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense.
And that's a running thing that happens a lot of times is like there's a distress call and, they have to answer it because they're the closest ship. And space is really big. So a lot of times you just kind of buy it and it's okay. But in this one, it really stood out to me because, they're right near Earth. So, and especially because they're, they don't have photon torpedoes. They don't have tractor beams. They don't have medical staff. So you'd think like, maybe send an escort with them since again this is a Federation flagship. So I think we can pick this scene to death, but there were just some like really big flaws in it just right at the beginning that if you really think about it kind of take you out of it a little bit. But the whole point is, like you said, Kirk needs to step up because Harriman's just not able to handle the situation, and it is a pretty big situation because they have the Nexus, basically this ribbon in space that's causing these gravimetric distortions and pulling the ships in and destroying them. So time is of the essence. This is not by the book. We have not experienced anything like this before. There's no, manual to read. It's like, okay, this is a life or death situation and it's happening fast. So you need a senior person to step in and handle the situation or people are going to die.
And people do die. I feel the opening scene of this movie makes the stakes of a ship, just a ship exploding with refugees on it, feel so much more real than any episode of the show that I've seen. And I don't know if that's because it's lit or it's shot better or what it is, but when that ship goes down and you see like the look on Captain Harriman's face, like this is my fault. Like I should have done something more. That hits me a lot more than, I don't know, for whatever reason, than a lot of those kind of throwaway scenes that they have in the episodes, because that's a pretty standard thing to happen in Star Trek. But it's I don't know if it's just how it was implemented or directed or what, but it just feels like it has a lot more weight. I did want to bring up about that whole opening section on the Enterprise B. One thing that absolutely blew me away in the comic book is that the background actors and the extras that are in those scenes, like the reporters, several of them don't have lines in the movie. They're just like shoving cameras in Kirk's face. There are some of the El-Orians when they beam them aboard that are just background extras that don't have lines. They all look like the actors that are in the movie. And so I don't know how 7 months before, the release date, they were able to get that much information, but you can't say that Gordon Purcell didn't do his research.
That was all the tiny little proofs that they had that they obtained. So they did have some photos from the set, but they were kind of like negatives, I guess, but before that time. So they were like looking at these tiny little stills, probably through a magnifying glass, and trying to recreate. So they did have some source material to go off of and like a few photos.
But a tiny film negative?
Yeah,
It's
it was
like,
probably painstakingly. So not to take away from what you're saying that, they didn't go through a huge amount of effort to recreate, what happens in the movie, and they do a phenomenal job, but they did have,
yeah,
something which
they
is
did have
barely anything.
something to go off of, right? And I think maybe that's why the major differences that I feel in the comic are just, well, for one thing, I think the Enterprise B section in particular and the climax of the movie in particular are the two scenes where I feel like the pace of the comic goes way faster than the movie. And
Yeah.
in the climax, I think it's a problem because it actually interferes with your ability to understand what's going on, I think. In the beginning of the movie, it's a problem because honestly, there are a lot of jokes or lines from the original series characters that in the movie are given a little bit of room to breathe, and there's a little bit of silence in between some of the lines where you're kind of seeing somebody's reaction, or the bitterness on Kirk's face, or some of those moments that are lost when they really just have to keep on popping and get to the next line of dialogue. So that's probably my major criticism, honestly, of the entire comic, is just that the pacing does feel rushed, especially in those two stretches of the movie.
Yeah, it's really just because they're using the script as their primary source. They're really just throwing the lines out there, trying to make some sort of representation of what they think is going to be in the movie, and then just kind of move on. They're not adapting something that they've watched in movie format and telling it a little bit differently, or that sort of thing. So they're at a huge disadvantage. And I think that translates into the comic. Like you said, the pacing just flies by, and you don't get the gravitas of the situations, the gravity of the situation, just that it's like so major, or the emotion of what's happening, or that, people are dying, or those kinds of things. There's no
There's just not time.
there aren't those effect shots because they probably didn't have any or hardly any actual, like, they probably had pictures of the models and sort of the storyboard idea of what they were going to do with it, but they wouldn't have the space scenes of what was actually going to happen. And they certainly didn't know that they were going to reuse footage from Star Trek 6, but that's a whole other thing when the Klingon bird of prey is destroyed.
Save a little bit of money on the explosion.
Yeah. So, but all that stuff is missing because that at least slows down the pacing of the movie. Is when we're watching the ships fight, nobody's
Right.
talking, nothing's really happening except for the space combat. And we also don't get that in this comic form. So,
Right. So do we want to head off into the kind of the next generation section of this movie then?
yeah. Yeah. I
There
think so.
was the main thing that I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong because I may have missed it in the movie, but there are like 3 times that there is a captain's log or an officer's log in the comic book. I don't think any of that is in the movie. I don't think they do captain's logs in the movies for the most part.
No, I don't remember seeing any in the movie. And it's funny because there was one I had in my notes to point out is when Picard is on the planet later trying to dissuade Soren from his horrific plan, he makes a captain's log, but he doesn't have his communicator because that was confiscated as part of a prisoner exchange.
Right.
And so, like, who is he talking to? Is he making a captain's log to like a tree root or an actual like log? Just carry a log around with him. This is my captain's log, It's
At the same time, though, like it's such an iconic part of the Star Trek show that it's kind of puzzling to me that they almost never use that in the movies. I'm not just talking about Star Trek Generations. I mean, like all of the Star Trek movies.
But usually it's because you're using that as a plot device to explain to the audience what's happening, to give them
Sure.
a recap after a commercial break, or maybe
Right.
they're just tuning in because the show started promptly at 7 p.m. and you aren't able to tune in until 7:15, so it'll catch you up because there is no pause or anything back in the 90s. So
Right.
it's usually what it's for. So in a movie, I guess you wouldn't need that as much because if you started at the beginning of the movie, you're still probably there. But still, like you said, it being important in Star Trek lore that's something that happens, you'd think there'd be at least one somewhere. But yeah, I think they took all those out for the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I just watched like the latter half of it today. Unfortunately I had to break it up into 2 viewings just because of, I've got way too much going on right now. But yeah, I did notice that in the latter half there were definitely none, and I don't remember them when they make the switch over to the TNG crew either. So I don't know. That was one of those things where like they did it in the comic book, and I kind of liked it. I kind of thought like, okay, well that's really kind of just a hallmark of Star Trek. And even though I know that it's very much created as that narrative device to sort of catch people up, it was kind of nice to have it in there. I don't know.
Yeah, or even Picard making a personal log to sort of explain maybe what's going on with him, or I just received some news, or something, but he just stays quiet and he gets grumpy and he runs off to his ready room after he receives the news that his family, his brother, have been killed in a fire, and it takes Counselor Troy sort of dragging it out of him to find out what happens. And that happens over a lot of time, but that's one of the big themes of when we first start with the Next Generation crew. But there's no logs, there's no conversation. I think one thing the comic does a little bit is, usually in comics we get to hear the inner dialogue of characters, and I think that would have been something really great for the comic, would have been to hear some of the inner dialogue of what the characters were thinking, what they were going through, not necessarily to tell you ahead of time. We can still find out the news in the right moment in the story, but just to shed a little more light, because in the movie you see Picard and he has this intense emotional reaction, and then he just sort of storms off, and so you're just sort of left wondering, well, what's going on? And then there's a crisis happening and they go to red alert, and Picard's just like, number one, you handle this. You take over, like launch an investigation, contact Starfleet. And Riker's just like, what's going on? Why am I, what's happening here? The captain is basically just ditching me, which I can handle this and I'll do it. But, usually they have a little bit more of a communication relationship there. So that was, I don't know that, a personal log or a captain's log would have solved that problem, but just, that was I guess a weird point of dialogue for me.
Okay, so I remember being confused the first time I watched this movie.
Yeah.
And there's a couple reasons why. First, they don't reveal what's actually going on with Picard for like another 20 minutes after he starts basically just kind of being a dick to everybody. He gets some, message on the holodeck, and you don't know what it was, but you can see that he's having some kind of reaction to it, but they hold that reveal, and I don't think that anything is gained by doing that. I don't think that that's something that needs to be suspenseful or a mystery. And honestly, it just makes Picard come off as a jerk until you get the reveal. And I was also confused the first time I watched the movie, because when they show a photo of Picard's brother and nephew, Robert and Renee, who were killed in a fire, that's the message that he gets. When they show a photo in the movie, it's different actors than they used on the Next Generation set. Now, what is awesome about the comic book is that they have a photograph in the comic of the original actors that played those characters on the Next Generation. So I'm guessing that the actor that played Renee had, aged out of being able to portray that role. Maybe I'm not sure what was going on there, but he's clearly he has a different color hair. His face is a little bit thicker. He doesn't look like the character at all in the movie. And there's actually a scene later where he has a speaking line. And again, it's just like, oh wait, that's Renee. I'm actually going to go ahead and make the judgment that the actor that played him in the episode Home on TNG was a little bit better and seemed to have a little more chemistry with Patrick Stewart. Maybe that's just because they got to work together longer. I don't know. But yeah, this is actually an instance where the comic book to me is clearer than the film.
Yeah, they actually went back to use sort of source material from the episodes, and that sort of gave them a leg up because they were able to preserve that continuity more than the movie actually did. And maybe it was due to rights, like maybe they couldn't use the actors' likenesses because they had photos from that episode that they probably could have used. So I don't know if it was an
Yeah, I
oversight
don't
or
know.
a rights issue, like a legal issue or what. But
I have no idea why that choice was made. It's never made sense to me, and it makes the moment where he reveals what happens not land quite as well, in my
yeah,
opinion.
I remember being confused at that as well. Like, wait, who are these people? And
Right.
maybe I didn't quite remember the episode as well as I do now watching it, but also having the different characters, yeah, really made it even more confusing. So
Yeah. How did you feel about Deanna Troy in the comic book, specifically in the scene where Picard is talking about what happened with his family?
so in the comic book, she seemed a little more like aloof or pushy, because in the movie you see her right away, like she's an empath, so she can sense strong emotions, and a lot of times she senses strong emotions from one starship to another, like across a pretty big amount of space. So her being in the holodeck with Picard, she senses right away that, when he gets that message, that something is going on. And so she comes back later when he's like ditching everybody and goes to his ready room, which why wouldn't you just tell Riker, hey, something just happened. I need some personal time. I'm going to my quarters, and then just disappear. But instead he's in his ready room because he's bound to his duty. He's not going to abandon his post, but at the same time, he's going to delegate a little bit more. So I guess that's in tune with his character. But anyway, Counselor Troy comes in because she senses what's going on, and she seemed a lot more kind to him in the movie. And maybe it's just
She
because
did.
because you have the actor and actress who've worked with each other for 7 years, sort of portraying the scene, and maybe it didn't translate as well on paper, or maybe they made it more emotional than the script originally called for.
I think mostly this is the script was altered after the fact
Yeah.
versus what they have in the comic book, because she has a line in the comic book where she's basically like, well, you better learn to accept, that mortality is part of life, or something like that, because you won't be able to get over it until you do, or something like that. And
Wow.
I mean, it's very direct and not how you would expect a professional counselor to deal with something like that. In the movie, I feel like her portrayal is much more of she's just listening,
Mhm.
and she doesn't talk quite as much, and the actress just emotes more, and kind of she'll maybe say something to sort of get him to continue talking, but at no point does she tell him like, hey, this is what you need to do. And so that was just bizarre to me in the comic. It seemed out of character for her, and it also it didn't portray her in a very good light, I thought.
Maybe that's why I didn't like the way she was drawn. Just because
Yeah,
I read the dialogue and I was like, ah.
the dialogue is definitely different. I mean, having seen the scene as recently as I did, and then going to the comic, I was just like, I mean, it's not even just her appearance. It's like the actual words she's saying are more like, well, here's what you need to do. You should put that into practice and be fixed now. And it's like, whoa, like calm down, counselor. Counselor
Yeah.
Hood.
Counselor Hood. That's what it sounds like he says in
I
the
know.
movie.
I know. It's one of those things where, like, until you pointed it out or somebody else pointed it out, I never noticed it. And now when I watch the movie, I it's like all I hear. So
Oh yes, come in, Counselor Hood. So we're going to go ahead and break here into a separate episode because we really have a lot to say on this one. So we want to spend as much time during the episode talking about the actual story. So thanks for tuning in for this one. Just stay tuned here for the next one, which will be up at the same time. So that way you can hear our thoughts. So thanks, and we'll see you again soon.
thanks everybody for listening. See you next time.